Hello and welcome to this episode of This Is Your Time. My name is Ernie Vecchio, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional guided evolution. My goal is to help you live with more heart, grow with greater clarity, and transform others with the ease of your presence. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about
the idea that we've got to broaden out our perspective so that we can contextualize our own inner condition. We have to be able to do that because we've got to understand that there are, let's call it, general human experiences. We all start out in the same divine ether, but we pass through that and we come into human existence. We also grow up in a family, which is also part of human existence, but for many of us, it's traumatizing. And we spend a great deal of the rest of our lives trying to put that into some kind of a perspective so that we can make sense of ourselves and it stops hurting so much. I'm getting a little bit more of an insight into the concept of suffering for compared with suffering with.
Good.
I'm beginning to understand the difference, some of the qualitative and substantive differences there, because there really are differences. Suffering for is kind of like bemoaning the fate. Oh, why is it me? Or, why did this happen to me? And it's really the idea of the dog running around in circles chasing its tail but getting nowhere is really the appropriate mental image for that process. Whereas suffering with is a whole different concept because it implies that there is realization and transformation involved in it.
Yeah.
And therefore, there's a purpose to it, and it can be transformative.
One of the discoveries that happened working at the trauma hospital is that, as you know, in intelligence testing, we give vocabulary tests. And I forget where compassion is on the vocabulary test, but it is one of the words that is asked for people to define. What I ended up discovering that a very large percentage of the population that I was testing would invariably define the word compassion with a 1-point response. And for the folks that don't know what that is, that's listening to this, a 1-point response would be to take care of somebody or to care for somebody, to love somebody. That's the 1-point response, I believe. The 2-point response is empathy and sympathy for another human being. In other words, being able to put yourself in the shoes of the other person would be the definition of compassion. So, and many people didn't even know the 1-point response. So what I found out is that the largest percentage of the people believe that compassion means to sacrifice or martyr themselves for another human being. That's a distortion that is tied to the Christ concept, that Christ died for us rather than with us. And as a result of that experience, we somehow have internalized that as a culture. And it doesn't make any difference, this is the part about it that was fascinating to me, what your religious background was. It's still in the culture. It's still in the culture. And so that distortion is huge. It's a subtle distortion, the difference between suffering for versus suffering with. And you're correct. Sitting with the pain means that you're actually observing the pain. You're observing the experience. And you realize that you are the person that's in pain, but you're also the person that's observing. And that observer from that neutral position is really loving. Because when you're observing, you're not criticizing, you're not analyzing, you're not attacking, you're not angry at whatever the suffering may be.
Could we talk about that a little bit? The difference between the neutral observer who could also be in a helping position versus the critic, the judge, of the director.
The way that I like to talk about this is, because it's such a good analogy, to make the distinction, there's a component of compassion that has to happen as the observer before the person can be transformed. And here's what it is. If you were going to go into a courtroom with a folder that was Jerry's life story, okay? And you have two judges in front of you, and you wanted these judges to reopen your folder because you feel like that somehow your life has just not quite gone the way you thought it was going to go, and you want to talk about it some more, okay? In a court of law, you know what that's called in a court of law when you get somebody to reopen your folder?
An appeal?
It's an appeal, yeah. So you're going in and you're appealing to the judge. Now keep in mind, this is the ego that you're talking to here. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So you're going into the ego and you're saying, wait a minute, life has not quite gone the way I thought it was going to go. I want to revisit this. The critical ego, of course, would look at your folder and say, you know what, you're a crybaby. Go back to your life and put your time in and stop your whining. This is what the critical judge would do. The compassionate judge would look at the folder and say, oh my gosh, the punishment doesn't even fit the crime. And so he would take the gavel, set Jerry free for time served. What's that called in a court of law when you're set free for time served?
Exoneration?
Mercy.
Mercy.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this,
mercy.
Yeah, and so mercy, you see, Jerry, is a real key component that has to happen, or it's a process, it's a level, when you're sitting with the suffering in that neutral position.
Well,
Yes.
it's hard to combine the elements of judgment, critique, not good enough, and mercy. There's no flow there. They don't flow together, generally.
Okay, and here's why. Okay, I gave you the analogy of two judges, both representing the ego, but one being compassionate and allowing, and the other one being critical and sending you back to yourself. Well, I left out the individual that's observing the two judges, and that's the soul's perspective. So the soul's perspective is to see that you have two choices, and instead of just one. As you deal with this business of suffering and adversity, you have the choice. When you're dealing with the ego, you have two choices. You can take the critical, controlling side, or you can take the compassionate side. And then you can identify with one of those two that you choose to identify with. And if you are the observer, and you are aware that you are an observer, you're going to identify with the compassionate one. You wouldn't, as the observer, of course, if you were conscious, identify with the critical one, you see.
Yeah, why would you purposely, beat up on yourself
Right.
and cause yourself additional pointless suffering?
Exactly. So the observer in this concept or in this context is the orchestrator. In other words, the observer is what brought the two judges together to begin with. The observer is the one that said, Jerry, let's take your folder in and revisit this. This is what the observer did. And so again, you have to say in this business of neutrality, which one do you want to identify with? Keeping in mind here that we have four components of what I'm calling the GPS system of the human condition. That being the soul, the spirit, the ego, and the human heart. You want to identify with all four of those simultaneously rather than one of those individually and separate from the other. They are all working together in tandem together, and this is what the difference between being awake to that or being asleep to that. If you're asleep, to that, then only two of those are operating at any one given time. Typically, the two that are working that you're the most aware of is the ego and the human spirit, because the ego is the adaptive function, so it's basically there agitated, and the human spirit is there as the provocator, and so it's provoking you along. And so those two things are working all the time. The soul and the heart are going off and online at random times, and you may or may not be conscious of those things. And so the point is being conscious of all four, yeah.
When we think of those two predominating factors, the provoking spirit and the ego that is judging and that is essentially causing that, what would you call it, a self, it's a self put down, it's a
Self-loathing.
Thank you. Self-loathing. That was the term that I was groping for there, but wasn't quite getting it. We could explain a great deal of misery that people would feel absolutely stuck in, unable to get away from it.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very powerful explanation for why so many people feel stuck in their misery without any reasonable expectation of finding a way out.
Yeah, and here's the distinction. The distinction is between emoting and feeling. Years ago when I was teaching classes in psychology and counseling, one of the typical questions that the beginning students ask is, which comes first, a thought or a feeling? And most of the college professors around this country would tell you that a thought comes first. Well, in actuality, the question is not asked correctly. The real question is, which comes first, a thought or an emotion? And in that context, a thought does come first. But in the context of thought versus feeling, a feeling comes first. And this is where it gets confusing. People don't know the difference between feeling and emoting. So when you say stuck in their misery, you're saying stuck in their emotions.
Consumed in their emotion.
Yeah, consumption is exactly what it is. And remember what emotion is. Emotion is a reenactment of the original source wound. We know that the fated original source wound is being cut away from the Creator and having to adapt to your world around you. That being cut away and that adaptation is the first original source wound, and then life hands the other wounds to you. And it kind of sticks to that source wound like Velcro. It's like a snowball. It starts out a specific size and tiny and gets larger as it gathers more suffering and more adversity.
Lacking awareness of the heart
Mm-hmm.
and the soul's intention, I can now understand how it would be easy for people to be stuck in that lack of awareness.
Yeah. Well,
of where those feelings, that fear of fear itself, that anger over that basic underlying fear would come from. Yeah. Because there's really, lacking that perspective, there's really no explanation for it.
We pathologize it. We take a cause and effect approach to it, in a linear kind of two-dimensional approach to it. It's kind of like if you went into the store today and to buy groceries, and somebody cut you off in line or something, and you got really, really angry. You could, if you were not awake and conscious, begin to take that event and in some accumulative way, begin to set the tone for your entire day. Leave the grocery store, get in the automobile, drive to work, cut people off in traffic because you're so angry about what happened at the store, get to work, be mean to your clients, be short with your fellow colleagues, and not really understand that what has happened is that event back at the grocery store put you in touch with something that had nothing to do with that moment, but it had everything to do with an original wound that you carry around with you every day. And if you're not in touch with what that wound is and where that wound came from, you'll make up you're in a bad mood today because something happened at the grocery store. Instead, if you observe what happened, it would be more like, wow, there's no way I could be this angry because that guy cut me off in line. What is making me this angry? And then you have to observe the anger and begin to look at the source. You realize it isn't present tense at all. It's past tense.
And this is the function of the human spirit, which provokes
the provocation,
awareness of where these emotions are coming from.
Yeah, the human spirit is the feeling reaction to the immediate moment, and so it's going to react. It is like it's like your sensitive piece, if you will. It's going to react to the immediate present moment, and that reaction is going to prod the ego to then reenact a previous experience. On that note, folks, we are out of time for this episode. I want to thank my guest this evening, as well as thank you, the listener, and would be grateful if you would go to iTunes and rate my podcast. This helps tremendously to make it visible for people who have yet to find me. And if you'd like to comment, please go to my website, ernievecchio.com, and go to the show notes for this episode and scroll down to the comments section. I'd love to hear from you, comments, questions, whatever. So in closing, please remember, your time is precious, so live it with intention.